Season 2, Episode 2 with Anthony Lauder, Expat Tips and Tricks.
This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, helping you become a better language learner by providing motivating weekly inspiration, as well as top tips and tricks from expert guests. And now, your host, Chris Broholm.
Hello friends, it's time for another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. And in the episode today, I'm talking to Mr. Anthony Lauder about being an expat. And this topic is quite topical for me personally, because I'm now when this goes live, I will be looking at where to go next. When I started learning languages, I was always fascinated by people like Benny Lewis and Jan van der Aar, Connor Klein, all these people who just travel all over the world and learn languages at the same time, and thereby experiencing a lot of cultures and basically expanding your horizon in a way, I suppose. And now finally I'm at a point in my life where I can actually do that, and I'm looking to sort of become an expat. And me and Anthony get into a talk about exactly what the word expat means and why there's it's a little bit of a confusing word, but it's a very nice episode if you're looking into relocating in general, because there are a lot of pitfalls and there are a lot of problems. As a personal side story, I relocated to the United Kingdom. I lived in London in 2010, and whilst living there, I had a fairly good time, a standard time. I was doing okay communicating with my friends and family on the computer, but outside of my home, I simply failed to make any kind of meaningful progress in getting to know people and also making new friendships and basically expanding my world. I did have a few friendships, but they were mostly from Denmark, not friends I previously had, but it's so much easier to connect to people from your own country. And what ended up happening was that I was stuck in a room very often, just not getting out. And of course, this was way before I got into language learning and joined the polyglot community and everything. But I think this episode is a really good one, because I know there's a lot of people out there who want to relocate, and all this advice that Anthony comes with after having lived in the Czech Republic for 10 years. And as we talk about in the interview, he's lived in multiple places, and he has a lot of ideas and tips to bring. And also a few, he busted a few myths that I used to have, and I think that's also very helpful. So if you have any ambition about moving abroad, I think this is a great episode for you. And before we get to the episode, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Language Hacking League by Benny Lewis, and you can join the league for free on actualfluency.com/league. And the cool part is you get a free video course sent directly to your email address. So, check that out. It's by Benny Lewis. We all know him. We all love him, at least most of us. And, it's a quality service. He sends out weekly language learning tips and tricks, and also links to other language bloggers. I've been happy or fortunate enough to be featured in the Language Hacking Club at least once before, so it's a good service. But let's move on with the interview of today, and it's Anthony Lauder. On the show today, I'm happy to welcome back Mr. Anthony Lauder from episode, what was it, 27? I should have probably checked this before, but
I don't know.
You were in previous episodes, and we talked extensively about your languages and sort of how you approach language learning as not a polyglot, but a polynot, and what that
exactly
entailed. And we talked about your presentation in Budapest. And if people are interested in sort of general language learning, I recommend going back to that episode first and then coming back to this one, which is more of the topic is expats today, which is a word that I want to talk to you about in a minute. But basically, once you've started learning languages, once you've started embracing other cultures, that kind of desire to move out into the world and see other parts and live in other places really grows strongly, I believe. Definitely for me, and I see it in other people as well. So that's why I brought Anthony back, because he's although he doesn't claim to be, but I find him a bit of an expert on the subject. So welcome back, Anthony.
Well, thank you.
So tell us your expat story. How did it begin?
Okay. It all began because I was working in London for a software company, that put me on an exciting project in their mind, but it turned out it was working on nuclear missiles. And I didn't like the idea of killing people. The boss said, oh, you've gone through this strict process of vetting with the Ministry of Defense, and now I was working at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment, and I didn't like it. They said, you don't have a choice. You've got to work on this project. And I said, I do have a choice. I'm leaving. So I resigned, and I was without a job. So on my first day of unemployment, I thought I'd better find a job, went to a jobs fair, and within 5 minutes I stumbled upon a man who said, ooh, you seem to be quite well qualified and interested in this computer geeky stuff. I've got a job opening for you. And it was in New York, and I was living in London at the time, and I thought, New York, that sounds exciting. So I said, yes, please, and within a month I was living in New York. And this then started my passion of living in lots of different countries. Yeah. So I lived in, I don't know, 10 or 12 countries, I guess, over the years. But now I've lost the desire to live anywhere else because I've been in Prague for a very long time, maybe more than 10 years. And it's the first time I felt at home anywhere. I never felt home even when I was living in England. It always felt like I was visiting, even when I was a child.
Wow. And jumping straight in there, do you think that that feeling from Prague is because you've sort of grown to the point where you want to settle down, or do you think it's because it just fits your personality perfectly?
There are two aspects to that. The first one is Prague is just an absolutely fantastic city, so it's hard not to like it. But the second is that just on the first day here, I felt I'd arrived home. It was a very strange feeling that everywhere else I always thought, this is a nice place to visit, but Prague just felt home straight away. Partly because it's a fantastic place, I'm sure, but there was just something about it that made me feel I was home. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. And what sort of challenges did you face when you first started living in a foreign country, let's say an unknown country, let's say New York, for instance, start out with?
The biggest challenge, I think this applied to me, but I see it apply to other people, is overexcitement at the beginning. You have all this magnificent fantasy in your head about how great life is going to be. So I thought, wow, New York, I'm going to be living a life like in the movies. The same thing for people that come to Prague. I see a lot of people come here, they get very excited with this imagined idea that they're going to be the next Franz Kafka. I'm going to be a great writer and I'm going to have this bohemian lifestyle and it'll be fantastic. And then after a few months, reality sets in, and a lot of people get very depressed then that they feel isolated, life wasn't like in their dream. So this is an experience I had with my New York life, that after the first 3 months of, my God, I can't believe I'm living in New York, reality set in, and it's, oh my God, I can't believe I'm living in New York. So I realized, set your expectations to be very realistic, that you're going to have all the same problems you have anywhere else, plus additional ones.
Right.
It's not going to make all your problems go away. It's actually going to make your problems increase. Yeah.
Right.
So
what sort of problems would that be?
Well, some very typical problems, for example, in Prague, are the language barrier, because it does take a long time to learn Czech unless you're some kind of super genius, which I certainly am not. And so the first thing is the language barrier. The second problem is that the whole bureaucracy system is very different here, and you can find it very frustrating. You say you have to make appointments for just about everything and wait a long time for everything and deal with annoying bureaucrats for just about everything. Yeah. And then the third problem that I see a lot of expats having is that not just in bureaucracy, but daily life isn't like it was back at home. So there's a slight culture shock. You know, your favorite ice cream isn't available in the store, or you can't find a movie in English because it's only available in, you know, the foreign language, or the pub doesn't have the same beer. Just minor daily things slowly grind a lot of people down. In fact, there's a very good expat website in Prague, And a lot of people post questions after they've been here for a few months saying, where can I get such and such a thing that I had in, I miss my breakfast cereal. So,
Right.
and it seems that people start to crave these very basic things, things that they had when they were kids that comfort them in some way. And you can't get many of those things. And so these expat issues people face are sort of emotional things, not just practical things. You get these emotional longings for things that you miss.
Right.
Yeah, I've met quite a few people who say they left because they were homesick. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, oh, I just miss what I had when I was a kid. They went to go home to their favorite ice cream and so on. Not necessarily friends and family, but to the things they're comfortable with.
Right. And it's probably connected to the overexcitement in the beginning because you're sort of setting unrealistic expectations. And when the new place you live in can't really match your dream world, then you're suddenly thinking, well, I was doing fine at home, right?
Well, I think it's that people's natural tendency is to think about what they're going to gain, but they forget about what they're going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
So, I hear Czech beer is the best in the world, and the Czech women are the most beautiful women in the world, and this kind of thing. And I know all the architecture in Prague is beautiful, but they forget they won't have the things that they had back at home, and many of them you take for granted, like newspaper delivery, for example. In the UK, you can get milk delivered in the morning and newspapers delivered in the morning, and so a lot of people go and collect their morning milk, make a cup of tea, read the newspaper. Those things you don't get here. You have to go out to the shop, and you're not going to do that at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
But so your daily routine can be interrupted by some very simple things that people start to find a bit unsettling unless they're prepared for it.
Right. And I guess it's not the things themselves. It's more like when you say they're craving their favorite ice cream.
Right.
It's probably just some kind of, like you say, emotional response to
missing stuff that they took for granted.
right.
Yeah. I have a friend who used to live in Germany, and she always would use a certain German toothpaste. And when she came to Prague, you couldn't buy that toothpaste here. So she makes trips to Germany every few months to stock up on this toothpaste, just because that flavor of the toothpaste is something that's comforting for her in the mornings. Yeah, really
So strange.
Yeah. Well, we are creatures of habit.
Yeah, exactly.
Seek these basic comforts, and so I've seen that people who leave, people who crash from the expat lifestyle and go home, it tends not to be because they've had major problems. It tends that they've been ground down by the missing tiny things. Yeah.
Right. And is there any way we can sort of mitigate that before we leave? If potential expats are sitting out there thinking, I'd like to move to, Czech Republic or Germany or whatever, is there anything we can do in our minds to soften this grinding effect?
There are things even I still miss from the UK, and every time I used to go back to the UK, I would stock up on English bacon, English sausages, and this kind of thing, so I could make full English breakfast for myself. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, Marks and Spencer is here now, so I can Marks and Spencer, yeah. The English shop, so I can stock up on them 5 minutes walk from my house.
That's nice.
Yeah, but I think the main thing is sort of like a Buddhist kind of thing, is to recognize that my unhappiness is about something very trivial. So yes, you can say, instead of saying, "Oh, I don't feel good here. I'm feeling homesick," just to understand what it actually is that's making you feel homesick is something that helped me a lot. Thinking, yeah, well, I know English beer is a different flavor, and I quite miss that. But that's not a reason to move back home, just the flavor of some beer.
Right.
So instead of having just this emotional feeling, something doesn't feel right, I have learned to sort of dig into that and understand where those feelings come from. And it usually is over something very trivial. Like, I remember there's a children's breakfast for babies, actually, called Farley's Rusks in the UK. And it's a very nice, tasty breakfast for babies. And I was really missing the flavor of this even though I hadn't had it since I was about 3. And I started to really pine for this. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. This is crazy. Living in Prague and thinking, I've got to go to the UK to get some Farley's rusks. I know it was a real strange urge I had. But just reflecting on it, okay, that's just this weird feeling. It's not a reason to move back to England.
Right.
Yeah. But on the other side, I don't want to trivialize the other reality, which is that why many other expats leave is, firstly, at least in Prague, companies, when they are getting rid of employees, from what I've heard, are much more likely to get rid of a foreigner than a local person. Because Czech law in particular, and in other countries, when I was living in Luxembourg, for example, the Luxembourgish law really makes it very difficult to get rid of an employee once they've been there for a certain amount of time. So companies, I'm told, will get rid of foreigners because those foreigners are less likely to sue them.
Wow.
They won't, if you have a visa, for example, which is dependent upon your job and you lose your job, you have to go back to your home country. So you're not going to be fighting through the legal system that the employer didn't give me 6 months notice or something. So losing your job if you're a foreigner is probably more likely than if you're a local. And that's always incredibly stressful, of course.
Right.
And the jobs open to you as a foreigner are often much more limited than those available to locals, unless you have some very specific skill that's in high demand. So here are some kinds of things. If you've got a job in IT or in finance, you're going to get a well-paid job probably anywhere. If you can speak English fluently, you can always get a job as an English teacher, but it doesn't necessarily pay very well.
Right.
Outside of those, you're probably going to be competing with locals, and you've got the incredible disadvantage that you don't speak the local language as well as the locals do. So I've met many, but you also want to live an expat lifestyle, which is more expensive than a local lifestyle. You want to live in a nice part of town, be able to go to the nice restaurants, go out with your friends to the expat pubs and so on. And that's a more expensive lifestyle than the locals would necessarily have. So I see people really struggling financially when they come here as well. Right. Unless they have very specific high demand skills. So it's not just culture shock, it can be a financial shock as well to many people.
Right.
Yeah.
And obviously the problem is that or at least I think that's what a lot of people think when they move to something like the Czech Republic, is that the cost of living is quite low, so their spending goes up unreasonably so. Suddenly you're eating out every meal and
Exactly. I see this. In fact, this is another thing I see, that a lot of expats tend to become, if they're not careful, socially isolated. If you're not here with your family, for example, you can't go home to your wife and kids at night and have your close relatives nearby, or the people you've grown up with from school. When you come here, you're on your own. And to make friends is a slow process. And you're not going to have those lifelong friends that a lot of people had. In many ways, your friendships may be more superficial. So you can easily become socially isolated.
Right.
And I see a lot of expats overcompensate in a way for this by going out every night, eating in restaurants every night, getting drunk every night. And that's fun, but it is a very expensive lifestyle. So as you said, life in Prague is relatively cheap if you're a local, but not if you're an expat necessarily, because you will be out. You would not want to live in the suburbs. Expats tend to want to live quite close to the center of the city. You don't want to live where it's an hour away from the center, because why would you want? Well, you'd want to enjoy the city. So apartments are going to be more expensive. The restaurants are going to be more expensive because they're close to the center, and so on. And your friends may be expats who are in high-paid jobs, possibly. So they won't want to eat in the local burger bar every night. So I've met people who came here, and I knew an Englishman who was working in banking in London, and he gave it all up to come to live in Prague because he thought it was beautiful. But after he'd paid his very high rent to live in the fanciest part of town, he had so little money left that he could only afford to go out once a week. And he was working from home. So he ended up trapped in his house effectively 6 days a week.
Right.
And pinning all his hopes on this one evening a week when he was going out with these other expats. And he became extremely depressed, and went back to London just within a few months. So, this is part of setting your expectations again.
Right.
If you want to live in the fancy part of town and have this wonderful lifestyle, it is not going to be cheap, even though Prague is theoretically a cheap city. In fact, that brings up another issue that's very important. Prague and a lot of supposedly cheap countries don't tend to have very many things that are middle priced. They tend to be two price categories. The really cheap stuff, and anything that isn't really cheap is a luxury item, which is very expensive. Right. So you see this in restaurants, for example. There are lots. It's changing a little bit now, but if you're in London or New York or something, most things are priced in the middle, and then there are cheap things and expensive things. But here there are sort of cheap, smoky pub kind of meals, and then fancy restaurant kind of meals, and not the massive amount of middle price things that you would typically find in other countries. And the same with clothing. You can get cheap, horrible clothing from the Vietnamese weekend markets, and they're really cheap and they fall apart. Or if you go to a fancy clothing shop, they'll be more expensive than they are in London or New York. So if you're an expat, firstly, when you first start out, you won't know where the cheaper places are. You'll only know where the expensive places are. And secondly, you probably won't want the cheap things that the locals are satisfied with. You won't be happy to eat their cheap meals, and you won't be happy to wear the cheap, ugly clothes. You'll want the more expensive ones. So you're living in the luxury end of the market. And many people adjust to the local customs, but I think most expats don't. They still live this relatively luxury lifestyle.
Right. And do you think it's also because of a failure to change your... when you go on holiday, you have this kind of euphoria leading to spending more money, which is why you see shops in airports, which is why you see shops at beachfronts and all this. Do you think people, when they leave as an expat, they kind of, in their mind, equate it to some kind of, maybe not a holiday, but definitely some kind of elevated style of living, not just everyday life, you know what I mean?
Well, there's a very interesting debate that happens quite frequently. I've seen this repeatedly for many years, actually, which is what's the difference between an expat and an immigrant? And an immigrant is usually a term that expats use to describe other foreigners.
Right.
So I think calling yourself an expat rather than an immigrant, firstly, is trying to elevate your own status. I am separate from the immigrants are the low-educated people coming and getting the low-paid jobs, and they live in the ghetto effectively. I'm an expat, and that means that I'm above the norm. So viewing yourself as an expat, I think, means you're seeing yourself as separate. If you're an immigrant, you're going to merge into the society, possibly in the bottom level of society. If you're an expat, you think, well, I'm this foreigner who's a bit exciting, and the locals should be happy to have me here. And so it's curious that I call myself an expat, even though I'm actually an immigrant.
Right.
I really am, because I've lived here for many years. And I'm reasonably, I think, merged into society, but I still call myself an expat. And I do have expat friends, not all my friends, but a percentage of my friends are expat friends. And when we go out, we are living, I think, this expat lifestyle in pretty fancy restaurants and all this kind of thing. So I do think there's a bit of, I don't know where it comes from, sort of snobbery amongst expats that we're special. And if we could redefine ourselves as immigrants, maybe we'd become more humble.
Right. Actually, I'm glad you brought it up, because that was a thing I just saw in one of the Facebook groups for language learners. Somebody brought up, or maybe it's even one of the expat groups, ironically, but somebody brought up why is it expat if you're, white person from a Western country, and if you're from anywhere else in the world, it's an immigrant.
Right.
And I thought that's spot on, isn't it?
I've seen the same debate many times.
There's really
yeah.
no excuse or no. It's just a snobbery kind of, like you say, elevating yourself. But I guess just having awareness that this exists will mean that hopefully when we go or the listeners go, they'll be more humble and more embracing of everything that the country has to offer from top to bottom.
Well, at the same time, it's very good to fit in, but certain things will not be pleasant to you. So, for example...
Go for it.
Yeah. For example, Czechs love eating brain and things like this. And there's a thing called zabijačka, which is the pig slaughtering. It happens usually once a year, and a lot of Czech people think it's the great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you
Okay.
just fell out for a brief second, but you are back.
Okay, okay. So there's this thing called zabijačka, which is where pigs are slaughtered, and many families will have a country home with a pig in it. It's got a pig, and somebody will come around and slaughter the pig, and the process can take the whole day. And some people make soup out of the pig's blood, and and they'll eat the brain of the pig and all this kind of thing. And I've had soup made out of pig's blood and lungs, and it was disgusting. And my local friends, the Czechs, were going, "This is delicious," and you're crazy for not enjoying it. So if you're not raised with that, you'll never enjoy it unless you're incredibly brave. And there are many things like it, like some of the Czechs that are pretty weird. Men wearing a business suit with white socks and brown sandals. It looks very strange, but socks and sandals seems to be a local fashion that local people are perfectly happy with, but I could never do it.
Right.
So there are certain things that you cannot embrace them because they just seem too weird to you.
Right. Even 10 years later.
Exactly, 10 years later, yeah. Or and another thing where you're always going to be an outsider, even if you speak the language well. By the way, that's one of the most important things, certainly, is to learn the language to a level where you don't have to be able to discuss great philosophy, but to be able to watch movies or go to parties and chat with people. That makes such an incredible difference because I see people that haven't made that step, and it is difficult. It does take a long time, but people that haven't made that step end up very much outside of Czech friendships. Mm-hmm. They may have a few Czech friends, but they're English speaking, just speaking in English with those people. But even if you do speak the local language perfectly, or at least not perfectly, very, very well. So I'd say my Czech I can handle anything now in Czech, even though my vocabulary in some topics may not be perfect. I can still talk about pretty much anything, and I can participate in conversations. So I think I'd say fluent in Czech now. But still, when you go to parties or when you're at dinner with friends, when the conversation turns to when the conversation is in the local language, very quickly, it'll be talking about cultural things that you don't know anything about.
Right.
So people will be laughing about old movies that you've never seen, or cartoons from their childhood, or pop stars that you've never heard of, books you've never read. I can remember one party where within a few minutes somebody brought a birthday gift, and it was a box of candy that was remade, a nostalgic type of chewing gum it actually was. Pedro chewing gum, which existed in communist times. And so this person brought this bag of chewing gum as a gift. And the person whose birthday it was overjoyed. And the rest of the evening was talking about candy from their childhood.
Right.
And they were all screaming and laughing. Oh, do you remember this one? Do you remember that one? And I was excluded from that conversation, not because of any vocabulary, but because of lack of being a child here. And you can't catch up on that.
Right. So what do you do then? I mean, I can see that problem immediately.
Yeah, sit there being very uncomfortable. Yeah. So you're always an outsider, even if you speak the language. And
Right.
there's nothing like going to a party or a dinner party or a birthday party or something like that. Nothing reminds you as quickly that you're an outsider as that kind of environment.
Right. So if
Yeah.
you're the only if you're the only non-Czech person at a party, it might get lonely very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is one reason I understand why an expat community can be quite comforting, because if you find people from your own background, you can talk with them about your favorite childhood candy and your favorite cartoons. And I meet maybe once or twice a month with other immigrants, other expats, just for this reason. So we go to a local pub, and we were ordering Scottish beer recently and talking about Scotland and English ales and all this kind of thing. And it's very comforting to be able to return to that. We talked earlier about emotional comfort and the need
Right.
for it. And so I think if you completely avoid the expats from your own background, you have to be very strong emotionally to be able to resist the need to go back to stuff that's comforting.
Right.
And so I do need this. I've realized that I do need to mix with expats occasionally, once or twice a month, not more than that.
It sounds like a top tip, actually, for aspiring expats is to, to kind of soften the blow of culture shock and
Right.
to try and, because I can relate a little bit to this. When I moved to England,
Yes.
I had this kind of feeling of I was relocating. I was moving into a new country, so I should embrace everything from the new country. And of course, English wasn't a problem, the language.
Yep.
And the culture I knew a lot about as well. But I was still having trouble because I guess I changed everything at once and didn't really try to bring some of that comfort with me and try to maybe meet up with more Danish people or, well, just any kind of maybe Scandinavian people and just try and bring a little bit of my personality with me. I guess that was because it was very difficult for me back in the UK. I was feeling very like we talked about earlier, in the apartment all the time, lonely, and
Right.
so for me, it sounds like if you can meet up with some people who share your background, or at least closer than the country you live in, then that could be a tremendous help, and perhaps indeed help you get better relationship with the non-expats as well.
Right.
Because I guess also that's a bit of a fear that's been put into people by some of the language learning big bloggers out there and people who've done traveling a lot. They constantly talk about, oh, don't get stuck in the expat bubble, and if you only speak English all the time, you can't learn the language. I guess some people, myself included, interpreted that as the expat bubble as something bad, whereas it
yes.
can really help you out.
Absolutely. I in fact, one thing on the expat versus the immigrant debate, what I find very weird is if you're an expat, people say, "Oh, don't mix with people from the other. Don't mix with the other expats. Get integrated into the Czech society." Blah 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 blah. Yet immigrants, people seem to think it's perfectly okay for a Chinese person to live in Chinatown,
Right.
for example.
Yeah.
Or in New York, there was when I used to live in New York, and there were little communities like Little Italy, or there was Little Ukraine, all these areas where people from that nationality would live in that area. But they were immigrants living there for the whole of their lives, and nobody said, "Oh, that stupid Chinese person's living in Chinatown. He should move out and integrate better."
Right.
So I don't know why we say it about expats. Why do expats have to necessarily integrate completely into society?
I
don't
don't know.
think you need to. So I think it's very good to mix with the local people and get into the local culture, and it certainly learning the language enriches your life immensely because all of that culture is then available to you rather than the very narrow amount of stuff that might be in, say, English.
Right.
But certainly, it's always confused me why it's okay to be Chinese and live in Chinatown or Italian and live in Little Italy, but it's not okay to be an Englishman in Prague going out with English people.
Right.
It really is quite, it's sort of another kind, maybe it's a language learning snobbery that, maybe there is some snobbery in the language community of, oh, I just throw myself in at the deep end and I only speak with the locals. Right. And that might be okay for some people, being heroic like that, throwing yourself in the deep end. But I think many other people actually benefit from spending at least some time with people from a similar background to their own.
Right, exactly. And one of the other things that I was thinking about having this kind of thing is that if it can help you to get a better, understanding of the surroundings, because you might get sort of views from, observations from people who have the same cultural background as yourself, you might kind of be able to talk about the Czech culture in an analytical way where you can sort of, that's why they did that and that's why they... Whereas if you're with a Czech person, they would never explain stuff like that to you because, well, that's their life. That's what they've been doing all their lives. So
right.
They don't understand that it might be weird for you to see a pig being slaughtered or whatever.
That's right.
Whereas an English person would say, I tried the weirdest thing today, guys.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, this is one thing that's, I think, really helpful for expats is that in many countries there are expat websites and certainly huge numbers of Facebook groups for where expats in a particular country, like in Prague, give help to each other. And the questions that people ask on these things are it's not always, where can I find my favorite candy? Many of the questions are actually asking for practical help. So somebody might say, I applied for my visa and I got a document back and I don't understand what it says.
Right.
So they'll take a photograph and post it and somebody will say, well, what it's telling you is you've got to go to this ministry and this is how the process unravels. So they help each other through the process of living here. It's not just, I only want to meet people from my own country. It's, I need help from people who've been through the same experience.
And understand why it's difficult, some of the practices.
Right. And also, talking about products, people may have this is a very common question. I always see people asking about some product they used back home and they want to know what the equivalent product is here.
Right.
See, so instead of saying, I have to have this particular washing powder that I had it back in the UK, you might say, I used to have a washing powder in the UK that stopped my whites from turning yellow or something like this. And people go, the closest Czech brand is this one, such and such a thing. So these expat groups aren't only about hiding from the locals, they also help you transition into society here.
Right.
And
you leverage that people have lived here for a long time as an expat and can sort of bring knowledge to the table.
Right, so they understand both sides, they understand what the journey you're going on because they've been on that journey before and the problems you're facing, exactly.
And that's exactly why we're talking to you today.
Oh.
Incidentally. But I had, we were talking about how it's totally okay to, and probably a great idea to socialize with expats. But what about the risk of, coming to a new country and you might not be speaking the language quite well? Is there a risk of living in that expat bubble, which we briefly touched on before? And if so, what can we give the listeners of practical tips, and myself as well, of practical tips how to, when you come to that new country and you maybe have a limited knowledge of the language, how can you integrate and start socializing with people who are not just expats speaking in English?
Yeah, so there are two things I'd say. The first one is it depends how long you plan on being in the country. So there are a lot of American students that come here, say, for 1 year, a year overseas, a year abroad. And for them, I would say, just go and live in that expat bubble. Because in a year, unless you're going to devote all your spare time to it. You're not going to learn Czech in a year unless you're incredibly gifted and have a lot of free time.
Right.
And the whole process of assimilating can be quite challenging. So just go ahead. If you're just going to be there a year, there's nothing wrong with living in that expat bubble and basically being a long-term tourist for a year. There's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
But if you're planning on settling in the place for more than a year, then two things help. The first is finding expats that speak your language. Sorry, finding locals that speak your language. So I have many friends here who have Czech friends, yet they don't speak Czech very well because those Czech friends speak English, for example. Mm-hmm. And those Czech friends will introduce you to their Czech friends who can speak English. So then you can they will introduce you to all the events and places that you want to go. They will take you to the restaurants that the locals go to and to the sports events that the locals go to. And the only thing you're missing there is the language. Mm-hmm. And when I first came to Prague, I couldn't speak Czech at all. And I would go to concerts, even to plays where I couldn't understand anything being said, but enjoyed the social experience with my Czech friends. So you can find, if you speak English, which I presume most expats will, there's nothing wrong with having local friends that speak English too while you slowly learn the language. And they will be able to introduce you to experiences that you wouldn't have if you only had expat friends. So expat friends are unlikely to take you to an ice hockey game.
Right.
They're unlikely to take you to some pub where there's some little local band playing because they probably don't know about it. Mm-hmm. So I think having Czech friends or local friends who speak your own language is a really good way to start getting integrated into the society. When you go to deal with the bureaucrats here, take a Czech friend with you. They'll know how to deal with the bureaucrats. They'll know you have to buy some flowers for this administrator because that will speed the process up, or buy a box of chocolates for that woman there and she'll stamp your form quicker than anybody else's. And they'll know all these things. So you can become integrated into the society by having local friends, even if you don't speak the language. Right. And then the other thing you have to do, of course, is to put deliberate effort into learning the language. And this is where I see a lot of long-term expats don't bother. They reach a level where they can survive. They can ask for things in a shop. They can say please and thank you, but they can't have a conversation.
Right.
And they do okay. And what they do is either live in the expat bubble and think, yeah, well, this is my life, and they're perfectly happy with it. Or they get a lover, a husband, a wife, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, who is local, and let that person do all the talking.
Right.
So this I see a lot. I see a lot of expat men, many who've lived here for 10 or 20 years, who don't speak very much Czech at all, but they get by perfectly because their husband or wife or whatever is a Czech. Mm-hmm. And so they don't bother learning themselves anything beyond the basic pleasantries, and they can do perfectly fine. They can visit the in-laws, they can go to parties and so on, and they just sit there quietly.
So interesting. I feel like I don't know if it's just because we're in a society where learning the language to a high functioning level is kind of it's almost obvious that that's what you should be doing, and yet when you see people outside in every single country, I'm sure, where people come to, they don't bother at all. Maybe they'll not even get to that first base where they can just, maybe they're just grunting and using English.
Yeah, but that's understandable to me. I understand it completely because if it's their first foreign language, imagine you can only speak English and you go to live in China or something, or you go to live in Prague or wherever. It's daunting, and your first experiences will be scary. And the language learning community is not normal society. Right. It's not the average person.
No.
It's people who firstly probably know several languages already, and then after your first one, it becomes much easier. But secondly, it's people who actually enjoy the language learning process. And for many people, it's not enjoyable. It's a painful experience. And it's hundreds and hundreds or thousands of hours of painful experience to get good in the language.
Yeah.
So I can really understand why people don't do it. It's like anything else that's painful. Keeping fit and going to the gym. We all know we should do it.
Yeah.
But how many of us actually do? You know, there are some fanatics who do sports all day and think it's the greatest thing. And I think that the language learning community is the same. Just like we see people who do sports all day and think, yeah, I should probably do that, but I don't. People outside the language learning community may see us and think, yeah, I know I should learn the language, I know, but those guys really enjoy it and I don't.
Right. And what can we do? You know, this is sort of a philosophical question. What can we do as ambassadors of language learning, if we were to be so bold, to sort of promote? Because you don't have to go from nothing to C2 in Czech to enjoy the language. Like the first, I mean, I'm just equating it to learning Russian, and it's taken me over a year to be able to just have basic conversations. So I know the challenges, but I enjoyed it along the way as well as just having sort of fragmented conversation as well. But how can we, you know, this isn't really an expert question coming to think of it, but how can we open up the sort of people who think it's painful to learn languages? How can we, what kind of promotion can we do to make it more accessible, easier, or better, or more fun?
I don't know if we should. You know, it reminds this whole idea that we should get other people to learn languages because it's fun. That reminds me a little bit of when you see the Jehovah's Witnesses standing on the street corners trying to convert people to their religion because they know how great it is, and if only other people would see the light, they would want to become Jehovah's Witnesses too. And I think in the language learning community, we're doing that a little bit. We're thinking, oh, this is great, what an enriching experience this is, and other people are missing out. If only they could see the light, they'd become language lovers too.
Right.
And I don't know if they would, because somebody asked me actually when they moved to Prague about learning Czech, and this person was working in the computer industry, creating websites, but he only knew HTML, the language for making web pages. And he said, oh, I want to improve my life. Would learning Czech give me a better job? And I said to him, no, learning Java or C++. That's the language you should focus on.
Right.
It'll triple your salary. And once your salary is tripled, you'll have a far better life than you're having now. You won't be living this very basic existence, hardly able to pay the bills. You'll be living a nice lifestyle on the money you learn from that, and that will be a much richer life. And I really believe that. I believe that our passion for languages takes hundreds or thousands of hours per language, and other people have other priorities. This guy would have been better learning C++ or Java for a few hundred hours in terms of improving his life. Learning Czech would perhaps enrich his life culturally, but he was looking for what would actually make a practical difference to his life. Mm-hmm. And language learning requires so much commitment. The only language I think is worth learning for career reasons is English. I remember several years ago, people were saying China is a booming economy. It's going to keep going like crazy, so everybody should learn Chinese.
Right.
MBA courses at university started having mandatory Chinese courses in some universities because China was going to be the great one to go, you know. And the Chinese economy did do very well. It has been doing very well. But all the successful Chinese people learned English. So when I've been to business meetings around the world, when I was in Saudi Arabia or in the Arab Emirates or even in Luxembourg or in Prague or anywhere, the business meetings are all amongst the executives are almost always in English wherever you are in the world.
Right.
So if you want to be successful, you should focus on the other things, in my opinion, other things in your career that will mean that you get into executive meetings and earn a high salary. And as long as you can speak English, you don't need any other language.
Right.
Now, the reason for learning a language then is for cultural enrichment, I think. So you can participate in the society.
Right, and that's after you've taken the decision to say, all right, I like this place. I'm going to possibly live here for a number of years. Or...
Exactly. So and I don't believe, just like I don't believe the Jehovah's Witnesses convert anybody. I don't believe they convert anybody to becoming a Jehovah's Witness unless that person is already inclined to do it. So, if the person is already inclined to learn a foreign language, then you can perhaps give them a helping hand. But I don't think you can convert somebody off the street who isn't that interested.
Right. I find it so fascinating, like you say, because it's so strange to look out and like you say, we are probably Jehovah's Witnesses in a way.
Yeah.
But what I was kind of brainstorming about was, is there some form of lesser Jehovah that we can, maybe Jehovah's Witnesses should do this, make like a transition religion, and then try to bring that on people first. No,
well, just like many people who are religious are part-time, half-hearted in their religion. Many people survive being part-time, half-hearted, interested in languages.
Right.
So there are most expats that come to Prague can handle the basics, and it's sufficient for daily life. They can get by. They know an A1 level of Czech. In fact, to get a visa, I think now, if you're an EU citizen, you can just come here and live here without a visa. But if you're not from the EU, to get a visa now, you have to pass the A1 level language exam in Czech.
Right.
And there are courses you can take, 30 hours, I think 30 hours of lessons that will take you to the A1 level. And that A1 level is pretty much enough to get by, to buy a tram ticket, to go and get a bottle of milk,
Sure.
that kind of thing. And so beyond that, the kind of more advanced level of the language isn't necessary for daily life.
Right.
Unless you really, really want to participate in society. And then there are only two reasons to learn a language. One is that you have to. It's a mandatory requirement. And the second is that you want to. So the have to.
Right.
If a person is moving to New York and they don't speak English, or moving to London and they don't speak English, they'll end up having a very difficult lifestyle. However, if you already speak English and you're moving to just about any other country, you'll get by. So if you can already speak English, the have to element is much reduced.
Mm-hmm.
So then it comes down to want to. And want is far less motivating than have to.
Right.
Because with have to, laziness can't come into it. And other interests, you're just forced to learn the language. But want to relies on willpower, and willpower slips away. We all want to lose weight. We all want to get fit. We all want a healthy diet. But we give up. And I think the same is true with language learning. This is so people come with the motivation of learning a language. They want to learn Czech, but they soon realize the A1 level is enough. And then their other interests take over, because we've all got limited time. And any hour you spend on language learning is an hour you've taken away from something else that you might find even more fulfilling.
Right.
So I don't believe that we should ram this down people's throats. I don't believe we should laugh at people or make fun of people or expect them to see the light. They've got other priorities.
Right.
And A1 is perfectly sufficient for getting by. If you say, I want people to get excited about language learning, that's fine. But the idea of they're missing out, what can we do to convince them that it's great? I don't think we can do anything.
Right. That's a very refreshing perspective, and certainly inspired some thoughts in my head.
Oh,
That's always nice. But Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you as always, and I'm strongly considering becoming an expat in Prague myself.
Oh, an immigrant. Good.
Oh yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, I'll be migrating. No, I don't know yet, but it's very possible.
Well, if you do, it would be wonderful, and I will certainly do my best to help you when you're here.
That would be fantastic. Do you have any sort of quick fire tips here on the final minute that we could that we haven't quite covered in the interview?
Yes. So when we say language learning is always difficult for the first language, and it gets much easier with later languages. The same is true of being an expat or an immigrant. The first time you do it, it's scary. You don't know what to expect. But after you've been to 2 or 3 countries, it becomes just like going to another city in your own country, something you don't even think about. It's not scary at all. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice for me, because my first experience was quite scary, so
right.
That gives me some hope for this one.
Yeah, it becomes less scary, So now I would be perfectly happy to move to another country, although I don't feel the urge anymore, but I would have no fear about it, having lived in quite a few countries. You just get used to it, just like you get used to learning languages.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and I hope to see you in person later in the year. I suspect you might be going to Berlin.
No, that's a good question. I'm not sure yet. I still haven't decided. It might be too late to even decide on it.
No. It's never too late for somebody like you, Anthony.
Oh, that's very kind. We'll see. I haven't decided yet.
Okay. Well, let me just pressure you to say that you should come.
Okay. All right. So thank you for the chat. You take care.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast. If you would like to get more out of the podcast, check out the VIP Club by going to actualfluency.com/VIP.